everyone. Good evening again. Welcome to the Envision monthly webinar series. And today we have with me a distinguished guest, Dr. Alvin Liu, a good friend and collaborator of mine. And let me say a few words about Dr. Alvin Liu first. Dr. Alvin Liu is the James Skills Junior MD and Heather Skills Rising Professor of AI in Ophthalmology at Wilmer's Eye Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And let me give a bit of background of Dr. Alvin Liu. He first obtained his MD at Columbia University, followed by residency training and virtual retina fellowship training at the world-renowned Wilmer Eye Institute of Johns Hopkins University. He was named an emerging vision scientist by the National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research in 2020, and he holds multiple appointments, and I'll just name a few key ones. First, he holds a dual faculty appointments at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, as well as School of Engineering. He's also the inaugural director of the James Skills Junior MD and Heather Skills AI Innovation Center, which provided a dedicated endowed amount of $10 million for the AI Center for Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Alvin specializes in implementing and scaling healthcare AI technologies, both in clinical and operational domains. He also has unique expertise in terms of operational experience in critical key processes for AI deployment in clinical settings, as well as stakeholder alignment and engagement. And more importantly, he has unique experience in the space of AI governance. He co-chairs the AI and Data Trust Council at Johns Hopkins Medicine. He is also part of the American Academy of Ophthalmology AI Committee, representing ophthalmology, obviously, at the American Medical Association AI Specialty Society Collaborative Meeting. He's also on the leadership team of a recently founded network called the JAMA Plus AI content platform. And for those of you who may not be aware, it is actually 6:30 a.m. In Baltimore for Dr. Liu. So it is our great honor and very grateful for Alvin to Alvin for doing this for us, waking up so early in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, and doing this talk for us. And now I shall hand over to you, Alvin, before we move on to the Q&A session. Over to you, Alvin. Thanks very much again.
Yichong, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Don't worry about it. As I mentioned earlier today, I have 3 young kids, so I'm used to waking up very early in the morning. So this is just fine. Yichong, can you see my slides? Just confirming.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for your kind introduction and invitation to speak to you today. I look forward to our discussion later. So today for my talk, I have 4 main objectives. First, I'd like to go over just some brief background information in terms of what is oculomics. Second, I'd like to talk about the theoretical framework for thinking about how oculomics could be integrated in healthcare delivery and how to create value from a business perspective. Third, I'd like to talk about some of the levers and considerations that we should think about when it comes to value creation using oculomics. And fourth, give you some potential real-world deployment scenarios that could ground our conversation and provide some more specific considerations. To start, I'd like to provide some context and definitions. So I'm sure all of us have heard of the term artificial intelligence. This concept actually has been around for decades. So when we talk about AI, it's simply our attempts to train a computer or system to think or act like a human. And again, it's been around for a very long time. The first generation of AI involves a lot of handcrafted rules that we try to teach the machine. And machine learning is a subtype of AI where we use a lot of information, a lot of data to train these systems to make predictions without the need for frequent explicit rules. So for those with a statistics background, regression analysis is actually a kind of machine learning. And there are other well-known classical machine learning techniques such as random forest, support vector machine, and clustering. And deep learning is a subtype of machine learning that will be the focus of today's talk. So deep learning is a type of machine learning. It has a lot to do with ophthalmology. When computer scientists first came up with the concept or architecture for deep learning, they were inspired by how the human brain processes visual information. And in 2025, when we talk about AI, both in the context of medicine and outside medicine, we really, for the most part, are talking about deep learning. And deep learning is very good at two different things. One is called computer vision, and the second thing is natural language processing. Computer vision means image or video analysis. For those who drive electric vehicle, for example, Tesla, the self-driving function is indeed an example of computer vision. For us ophthalmologists, of course, image analysis is very important since our daily lives, both from a clinical and research aspects, involve a lot of image analysis. When I come to natural language processing, it simply means the ability for these machines and computers to understand and interpret human language. And again, like people have been trying to train systems to perform natural language processing for a very long time. But this capability really took a giant leap with the rise of large language models, which again is a type of deep learning. So here's a list of deep learning-based computer vision applications in ophthalmology. For today's purpose, I'm not going to go over all of them, but just want to show you if we look at the literature and think about this on a high level, more from an intellectual academic level, these are the 7 major applications of deep learning ophthalmology. And for today's purposes, when it comes to oculomics, the 2 categories of applications that are more relevant are classification and segmentation or quantification of biomarker. So next, I'm going to talk about what is oculomics. So oculomics is a field of science that studies the correlation between ophthalmic and, for the most part, ophthalmic retinal biomarkers and systemic health states. This has gained a lot of attention in recent years, but again, the concept has been around for a very long time. Decades ago, research scientists have described changes in the retina in patients with poorly controlled blood pressure. And of course, we do know that for patients with diabetes, oftentimes we'll see changes in the retina as well. So for a very long time, we do know that there are high degree of correlation between the retina and the rest of the body. But this field has advanced tremendously in recent years, and now we can use this information in a much better way. And I'm going to explain why. So maybe I'll take a step back and explain why is this even possible to begin with. So the retina is the only place in the body where we can image blood vessels and brain tissue at the same time, non-invasively at a micron level resolution. And to put this into perspective, there are 1,000 microns in 1 millimeter. The typical resolution of a MRI brain imaging is 3 millimeter. We know that when it comes to OCT imaging, the resolution is in the order of several microns, which means that retinal imaging, especially in the context of OCT, can have over 1,000 times higher resolution as compared to conventional brain imaging. So, as I mentioned before, the concept of oculomics has been around for a while, but really changed in recent years was 2 things. One, our imaging, our hardware has become much better. So now we can now we can have a much higher density information. And second, with the rise of cutting edge AI techniques, specifically deep learning, we're much better at extracting this information from images. With these 2 things combined, now we can derive much more actionable information when it comes to AI-based oculomics. So, what exactly can we predict by combining deep learning and retinal images? And this is what we could predict in 2025. A person's age, biological sex, blood pressure, body mass index, blood count, and smoking status. These all sound good, but they're not very practical, but because you can really ask someone's age, whether they smoke or not. And for a lot of these tests, you can simply do a blood test. Now we can dive a little bit deeper, and these are the more useful use cases, which is the focus of today's talks. So, science has advanced quite a bit in the past few years, and now when we talk about AI-based oculomics, these are the three category of diseases that we can predict that are more useful, that can provide actionable information. And the three big categories of diseases that we can predict directly from retinal images, and for the most part, color photographs are neurological diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and kidney diseases. When it comes to neurological diseases, we could predict the presence or absence of dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease to a lesser extent. When it comes to cardiovascular diseases, we can predict the presence or absence of coronary heart diseases and predict whether a particular individual is at a risk for having a major adverse cardiovascular event in the near future, such as a heart attack. And when it comes to kidney diseases, we could predict the presence or absence of chronic kidney diseases. And if someone does have chronic kidney disease, we could predict whether the cause is from diabetes or not. I would like to emphasize that the prediction of these big three categories of disease is definitely superhuman, meaning right now in 2025, no ophthalmologist can ever just look at a retinal image and give you those predictions accurately and confidently. And I'm pretty sure in the future, no matter like even we wait 50 years, 100 years, no other humans can ever confidently predict these things on a regular basis. And that's why AI-based oculomics is so powerful. Next, I'd like to pivot into, after giving a basic definition and some background information on oculomics, how we could think about where oculomics fit in terms of healthcare delivery, and on the theoretical level, what kind of value it could bring to society. And before I do that, maybe we can just talk about how neurological diseases, cardiovascular, and kidney diseases are currently triaged and managed. And of course, I'm talking about in general terms. These conditions are managed differently across the world, but I think for the most part, we can agree that um, this is the general framework that we see around the world. So for a lot of people around the world, definitely in the US and presumably in Singapore, the first step of your healthcare journey from a patient perspective is your primary care doctor. You may go see your primary care doctor once a year. At that visit, you may or may not have specific symptoms or signs. And then based on that particular visit, your primary doctor will then order some tests. And then depending on the results of the test, you get further referred to a specialist if necessary. So that's typically how it works in many countries. The problem with this paradigm is that, at least in the US, there's a long wait time to see primary care doctors, and maybe even a longer wait time to see specialist physicians. And then in the significant portion of population, especially in the lower middle income countries, patients may have no access to primary care at all. However, given the advancement in AI-based oculomics, uh, a new paradigm is now possible. Imagine a world in a not so distant future. You can walk down the street, go to your favorite local supermarket or pharmacy, and you can just sit in front of one of these off-the-shelf, commercially available fundus cameras. You get your retinal images taken. These images are uploaded to the cloud where they're analyzed by different AI models. And within minutes, you are being told whether you're at risk for, neurological diseases or cardiovascular diseases or kidney diseases. Since you're getting the results on the spot, you could then actually be triaged accordingly and then be referred to, let's say, a cardiologist if you're found to have an elevated risk of having a heart attack in the next 5 years. This could change the way that we deliver medicine fundamentally. And this is a schematic representation of what this new AI-based economics could do. So we could perform these retinal imaging in the community beyond your traditional healthcare setting. Again, like when I say community, I really mean deep in the community centers, pharmacy, supermarkets, etc. And once you perform this pre-screening, you will either be referred to a primary care doctor in a more targeted fashion, or in circumstances, for example, if you are identified to have a very high risk for having a heart attack in the imminent future, you may get referred to a specialist right away. And the benefits of this new paradigm is that, in fact, we're creating a much wider patient funnel with improved access. Second, we could perform more precise upstream triage, which in turn leads to more efficient utilization of healthcare resources downstream. And third, overall speaking, this should enable early detection and intervention, which should lead to improved long-term patient outcome. And this is what I mean by a theoretical framework to think about why and how AI-based oculomics could improve health outcomes. While this all sounds very promising, these are some of the considerations or levers that we should think about when it comes to how to exactly create value if we were to deploy AI-based oculomics. So first, we should think about which conditions to tackle. And in making this determination, it will depend on the disease burden and prevalence of the location where you want to deploy AI-based oculomics. And also, we need to think about the maturity of the technology, product, or company that's providing this pre-screening services. And I can tell you, for example, in the land of oculomics, if you look at commercial available products and models, the models that are involved in predicting cardiovascular risk, for example, are more mature and more validated than the products that are used to predict the presence or absence of kidney diseases. The second consideration is who the buyers are and who your audience is. So these are some of the categories of buyers that are the usual suspects. For example, the payers, and in many countries around the world, the government is typically the most important or biggest medical payer, really like in charge of paying for medical services. Um, your buyer could be provider organizations, for example, clinics or hospitals or integrated health systems. And also, you should really think about once you identify your buyer of the service, what is the goal of deployment? Are they trying to use AI-based oculomics as a patient acquisition tool, as a patient funnel, or are they really wearing the hat of public health and really trying to improve metrics on a population level? The third consideration is who are your operational partners? As you can imagine, in order to roll out and implement AI-based oculomics properly, there are many players involved, and oftentimes it does require a lot of consideration when it comes to operations. For example, where you want to do the pre-screening, how are you going to perform image acquisition, how you are going to train in personnel, and once you have appropriately identified patient at risk, where do they go next? How do you do downstream coordination? So these are all operational considerations. So your operational partners will be quite important. The two major categories of operational partners, they can be a horizontal platform, for example, an organization that runs a bunch of primary care clinics, or like a series of community centers, or you could be dealing with a partner that's vertically integrated, meaning they either own or operate, healthcare delivery sites that are vertically integrated on the in the patient journey. For example, you could have an organization that runs a series of primary care clinics, but they also run and operate subspecialty clinic along that vertical integration. And also another consideration is the size of these partners and how much resources they have, particularly when it comes to manpower. The fourth category of considerations is your go-to-market plan. And this is relevant for both the vendors, for example, the startup companies that provide this service, and also the buyers of this service. Whether you are trying to set this up as a direct-to-consumer, such as a wellness products, or you're trying to deploy AI-based oculomics as a pre-screening tool, meaning if you position this as a pre-screening tool, then this typically means a lower regulatory requirement, but also more uncertain reimbursement. On the other hand, if you are trying to position this as an actual diagnostic tool, then typically this will require higher regulatory requirement. But then again, if you are successful in pushing this through and getting regulatory approval, then there will be a higher reimbursement certainty. So next, I'm going to talk about the last segment of my talk, which are some of the potential real-world deployment scenarios. I am not presuming that I'm a world expert in the healthcare delivery systems around the world. So these are just high-level examples. However, in designing these examples, I really drew from my frequent and recent conversations with our partners and collaborators and stakeholders around the world. So these examples really are indeed grounded in some ground truth, but take it with a grain of salt. These are for examples only. And for I have several scenarios I like to just go over with you. And for these examples, I like to focus on two different use cases. The first one is in the detection of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And the second one is in the prediction of elevated risk for future major cardiovascular events such as heart attack. And I picked these two use cases because of the maturity of the technology and product that already exists in the real world and the commercial traction around these two use cases, especially in terms of the startup companies that perform these functions and the venture capital funding they have attracted. So when it comes to the first use case, which is dementia and Alzheimer's, I like to walk you through two potential scenarios, one in Singapore and one in the US. So I'll start with the Singaporean example. And again, this is an example. In this situation, the buyer could be the Singaporean government, and the goal could be to support the action plan for successful aging while being integrated in the primary care first approach. We could consider performing this pre-screening at active aging centers, which are scattered across Singapore, and we could deploy a product, a model that can make a binary prediction of poor versus normal brain health. After we perform the pre-screening, if we identify patients who are flagged as having poor brain health, then we could perform MoCA, which is a very common and validated cognitive test to really evaluate for cognitive impairments. If the MoCA is within normal limits, then further evaluation could be used using the BEAT AI score questionnaire. Again, it's quite a common and validated questionnaire in the field of dementia. And then optimization of modifiable risk factors can then be performed by case manager. However, on the other hand, if the MoCA test is not normal, then these patients could be referred to a polyclinic or GP for a full Alzheimer's disease workup. The scenario is going to look very different in the US. So unfortunately, compared to Singapore, the US does not have a robust primary care program. In fact, That's probably one of the major weaknesses of the US healthcare system, where we do specialized care very well, but we really don't have a coherent framework for primary care, and definitely not coming from a federal level. So, for that reason, if we were to deploy AI-based oculomics specifically for the detection or pre-screening of dementia or Alzheimer's, it is hard to perform this within the framework of a primary care first approach because we really don't have very robust primary care. So in the US, I would argue that the buyer will not be the government, but instead be big pharma companies. And the goal of this deployment is to support clinical trial recruitment and really democratize patient access to clinical trials meant for Alzheimer's. And the pain point of this deployment, the pain point that this deployment is trying to solve is the costly nature of clinical trial recruitment in general, but specifically for Alzheimer's disease. As you may could imagine, in general, just running and recruiting for clinical trial is very labor intensive and very costly. And you look across the different categories of clinical trials, Alzheimer's clinical trial is one of the most expensive ones. And this is due to many different reasons. However, there are two main reasons why it's so expensive to run Alzheimer's trials. First of all, it's hard to find these patients to begin with. And second, by the time these patients show up to clinical trial sites, oftentimes they present really late with advanced dementia, which precludes them from participating in Alzheimer's clinical trial because most of the drug candidates for Alzheimer's right now are intended to treat early stage or moderate Alzheimer's. If you show up to clinical trial sites with advanced dementia, you will actually not be eligible for these clinical trials. So in the US, this could happen. We could perform pre-screening in the communities, for example, in pharmacies and supermarkets and shopping malls. And this, in effect, will create a much larger patient funnel. And hopefully, by doing this, we can catch and identify patients with earlier stages of dementia. And once we identify these patients, we can then refer them for clinical trial sites for further evaluation. Again, this is really a patient acquisition tool to vastly increase the patient acquisition funnel to enable more efficient and efficient recruitment of patients for Alzheimer's clinical trial. Next, I'm going to talk about the second use case, which is using AI-based oculomics to identify patients at risk for major cardiovascular events such as heart attack. And the two scenarios I'm going to use will be Indonesia and Australia. So when it comes to Indonesia, this is a potential scenario for which how it could play out. The buyer here could be the Siloam Hospital Group, which is the largest private hospital chain in Indonesia with 41 hospitals. The goal is to increase their own cardiology clinical volume. And from my conversation with them, they could certainly see a lot more patients in the cardiology clinic. And in terms of implementation, we could deploy AI-based oculomics pre-screening, again, in the community, for example, at shopping malls. And in this particular example, it does make sense because the Siloam Hospital Group is part of the Lipo conglomerate, which also operates 70 shopping malls around the country in Indonesia. So again, for a lot of these implementation, knowing your audience, knowing your potential buyer really is important because they may own other assets that are not healthcare related that can really aid the deployment of AI-based oculomics. And another example I like to give is based in Australia. In this particular scenario, the buyer could be Osha Health, which is a chain of primary care clinic. In terms of implementation, pre-screening for cardiovascular risk could be performed in the community. In this particular example, there are three different ways where value can be added. Number one, it create referrals and downstream actual billable service for Osha Health. And in Australia, there's a specific billable service called Heart Health Assessment. It's a direct revenue generator for this healthcare chain. And the second value add is that it could facilitate the development of the so-called GPs with special interest GIPSy pathways. This is a very specific Australia pathway. And third, really help create brand differentiation for OSHA as compared to the other primary care chains in Australia. So hopefully in the four examples that I gave you, I was able to give you a sense of how AI-based oculomics could play out in the real world and how it could generate value in very different ways depending on your audience. And these are some of the take-home points. With the rise of AI-based oculomics, there are many promising business opportunities. However, we really need to think outside the box. Most of the people here in this talk, probably include myself, come from an academia background, and we always train to go for maximal scientific rigor, right? So when we evaluate a paper, evaluate a product, we really care about the performance, how well the product does, and that's all good. However, real world deployment is different. A lot of times you don't need A++ products. Oftentimes you can have a quote unquote good enough products, but it can really generate a lot of value, especially downstream, if you can implement it correctly. And the third point is when it comes to AI-based oculomics, I think broadly speaking, it really is a pre-screening tool. And of course, there's a lot of value in proper population-based screening. However, I think a lot of value generated really is downstream. So when we are evaluating this approach, we really need to think about vertically, not just the value created at the horizontal level. And fourth, depending on how and where you want to deploy AI-based oculomics, we really need to know the audience, what their interests are, what are their goals, and whenever we're trying to deploy this, whether you are coming from a university perspective or health, like integrated health system perspective, or whether you are a vendor that is providing the service, be prepared to demonstrate return on investment. And this can come in different forms. The ROIs can be calculated in terms of public health or operational efficiency, or even like financial ROIs. Despite the exciting prospects of AI-based oculomics, there's still a lot of work ahead of us. So for example, we will need to figure out the optimal referral workflow once we identify patient at risk. And the optimal referral workflows will definitely be dependent on the medical condition we're interested in and also where this AI-based oculomics is being deployed. And second, as a society, it will be important to have some baseline level consensus for who's paying for what, why, and how much. And third, perhaps most importantly, the alignment of incentives for all stakeholders from day one is very important. As you can imagine, AI-based oculomics is a very different and new way of doing things. There are many stakeholders involved, including the patients, primary care physicians, specialist physicians, software company, hardware company, governments, and medical insurance payers. For this to work, everyone has to be somewhat aligned, and I think it's critical for all the stakeholders to be in the same room at the same table on day one, and to the best of ability, really trying to align everyone's incentives for this to work. And that's all I have, and I look forward to a discussion with everyone here.
Thank you very much, Alvin. And just to let you know, there are close to 500 people online now. And congratulations on wonderful talk. High standard as usual. And a great summary. I think one of the very unique ones because you not only cover one use case, but three use cases. The brain health, the CBD, the CKD, and across a few settings. And you even touch on Singapore. And I can clearly tell that you did some homework on Singapore landscape as well. So kudos to you. Thanks very much for doing that. And to relate that to US perspective and also to Australia and Indonesia as well. I think we were in for a treat and just in a single setting, we managed to get perspectives from all over the world within the region as well. So thanks very much again for the unique insights. Next, we will move on to the Q&A and panel discussion session. Before we formally begin the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. David Chen, who is a consultant ophthalmologist at National University Hospital, Department of Ophthalmology. He's also an assistant professor at NUS Medicine. And another interesting point about David, he was formerly a Stanford Biodesign Fellow. So he's very much into the space of digital tech, health tech, and one of the key persons to be part of this discussion as well. So thanks very much, David, for joining us for this panel discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. And in order not to surprise you too much, so maybe I shall kickstart with the first question, something that I noted down for Alvin, and before I hand over to David and the general audience for further questions. So Alvin, so at the very start, the first few slides, you talked about the wide funnel, which I very much like the idea, the framework that you propose, wide funnel, a more efficient triaging, streamlining. And some of my conversations with other colleagues with the wide funnel, there are two sides of the coin. One, it helps to promote, enhance access to care. At the same time, there's also a concern that we are allowing access too loosely, too easily, and there will be a lot more patients, and there's a possibility that it will eventually overwhelm the tertiary system. I'd like to just hear your thoughts in this area. Thank you.
This is definitely an important consideration because probably you look at most places in the world, especially, developed countries, specialty care is already quite overwhelmed. I'm sure your cardiologist friends in Singapore, they don't really need more patients. So the question is all about balance. It's location specific. Again, like I'm speaking in more theoretical terms. So if you use cardiology as an example, even you look around, so-called developing countries around the world, there are two possibilities. Yes, everyone gets a lot of patients, but either you see like you get a lot of referral from primary care that should not be there to begin with. So yes, you have a lot of patients, but for example, you see a patient with some risk factors from future heart attack, but what they really need to do is to be medically optimized. Even if you get to a cardiologist, there's nothing new they're going to do that's going to be different from primary care. So that's definitely one like considerations, and we see that quite a bit in the US where we like for example, I'm a retina specialist. I see patients with retinal problems. The way that's referred to me, a lot of patients actually don't really need to see me. So yes, I'm very busy, I'm very overwhelmed, but they should not be coming to me to begin with. I can imagine that like playing out in, let's say, cardiology as well. So a better triage is important, and depending on how you set the lever in terms of threshold, in terms of sensitivity versus specificity. The broader question is, ultimately, I think if you take away all the players involved, this is likely something that the government should be involved in the sense that it only makes sense for them to plan this on a population level. On a, cost-effective terms, if you do this correctly, eventually you have a better mix of patients going to the specialists downstream, and eventually you do save money by identifying patients early on. And yes, you end up seeing a lot of patients with milder disease, and you end up needing to treat them. But the system saves money because you don't end up treating a lot of costly patients with advanced disease. That is the theoretical math behind why we want to do pre-screening and have bigger funnel. But one needs to do the actual math, the math will look different for different countries. So those are definitely some concerns of the overwhelm, of having a bigger funnel and a lot more patients. But in the end, the math should check out, but someone needs to crunch the numbers.
Thank you, Alvin. I like the analogy. Good to screen broadly, but at the end of the day, it's more about the efficient triaging. David, over to you. Any questions from you, or you like to take any questions from the audience?
Hi, Alvin and Yizheng. Thank you for having me. And it's a very refreshing talk coming from a fellow clinician innovator. I think I specifically liked what you mentioned about how any innovative solution needs to be target market as well as audience specific. Depending on who your buyer is or who your actual customer is, it needs to be tailored to the specific audience for your solution. And I think that's what biodesign tries to emphasize to us as well, where we have the end buyer in mind when we come up with a solution. And with that, I think whenever we're coming up with a new area of technology, oculomics in this case, we always talk about predicates. We look at whether there are previous examples. And I think the first anonymous attendee's question was, are there any such examples of real life cases that have already achieved the status that is being available in the US market already?
So the short answer is no. As far as I'm aware of, if we talk about AI-based oculomics, meaning, for example, the big three diseases, neurological, cardiovascular, and kidney diseases, I'm not aware of any products that's been cleared by the FDA. I know there are ones that are going through the FDA pathway right now, and my suspicion is that when one of them gets through the FDA approval process, likely they would have gone through the de novo process, which is a very specific pathway within the FDA for products that does not have any predicate. And a good example in our field is autonomous AI for diabetic retinopathy screening that was first approved in 2018. That product went through the de novo pathway, and the subsequent ones, there are three companies in the market right now with 4 products. The subsequent products in the US came through the 510K because after the first one, that was predicate. Now, this is an important point that you brought up because I think for those with a medical device background, especially going through an FDA, it's a quote unquote gold standard, right? That's how people do it, or going through EU with CE marked, and that's fine. The problem is that when it comes to this process, it's very expensive, it's costly, and it's hard to be scalable. And also, while people say if you're not FDA approved, then you will never get reimbursement from payers, which is likely true. But that's just one way in scaling a product. And that's going back to my point of a good enough product sometimes is good enough, meaning the traditional gold standard way is have a really, really good product, spend a lot of money on it, get through FDA approval, you get cleared, and perhaps you'll get reimbursed by payers. That is fine. But in this situation, for example, specifically for AI-based oculomics, where your goal is really create a much bigger funnel, you could consider an alternative strategy where I don't want to go through FDA approval, I save a bunch of money, I have a good number of products and I don't depend on payers to pay me. Or you end up getting paid not because of how good your product is at that horizontal level, but if you're able to really demonstrate ROI downstream that's specifically linked to your products, then people may be willing to pay you for that. So using the cardiology, product as example, for example, the Indonesia example, right? I can imagine a scenario where you don't get approval, but you're able to demonstrate to that local hospital system that you deploy this in the community, you get X number of new referrals to the cardiology clinic, they crunch the numbers, that's increased revenue, they are willing to pay for it. So even though it's not approved, it generates revenue downstream, they're willing to pay for it. On the other hand, if you're able to do some pilot, again, for example, in Singapore, you demonstrate a government that well, this product it's really just good enough for a pre-screening tool, not a definitive diagnostic
Mhm.
tool, but you end up triaging patients more efficiently. You come up with some KPIs that the government likes. Then they may say, hey, I see value in making the referral workflow in Singapore more efficient or more optimal. Because of that, that is net value generated. I'm willing to pay you for that. So I think David brought a very good point, which is FDA is the gold standard path. But I think one needs to think about many different pathways to bring the partner kit other than FDA. Otherwise, we'll see very few real world implementation.
That's a great answer. And I think in biodesign, they also mentioned this thing about blue sky innovation and incremental innovation, like two different extremes. And I think if you want something that is not too difficult to achieve, not too high budget, you can go for incremental products that are good enough to be better than what the gap is currently is missing, and you can launch it to the market as well.
And the problem with blue sky innovation is that I think healthcare is very special, and especially in developed world, healthcare is highly regulated, and so I think oftentimes the best solutions, the blue sky innovations, almost never win.
Mm,
The ones that win are the solutions that best align incentives.
mm, absolutely. I
Well,
have a
that's a
follow-on
good
question
point.
actually. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
Ichong.
please, David. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah, that
My
because
my next
there's
question,
that's
okay,
related to
sorry
this as
for
well. Okay.
My next question is actually more relevant to maybe a different area, not in the US, because, you know, for example, in the US or even in the UK, the NHS, we've got a wealth of information on cost effectiveness studies, on disease burden studies, and essentially cost of health and cost of disease. And when we are coming up with solutions, in those places, it's easy to peg against those benchmarks, those references, those studies. What about in other places where the market is smaller, as Singapore, where certain areas, the numbers are not as nicely rounded, and especially you mentioned Indonesia, there may not be such nice population-based studies to demonstrate the disease impact or disease burden. So, as an innovator or as a company who's trying to launch a new product, how do they crunch the numbers to make it look sensible to either the government or to the payer to make sure there is a financial opportunity or economic opportunity for them?
Um, this really go, I mean, cost-effective analysis are nice, like, and it's always good to base it on, you know, numbers and whatnot. But when it comes to, more like business side of medicine, a lot of it, it's also emotional, right? Like we live in an imperfect world of imperfect information. So, for example, if you go to some of the countries where it's not like really good data and you cannot definitively produce a cost-effective analysis, that's when the politics and arts of business medicine comes in. And it goes back to the stakeholders. Who are the ones in charge and what do they care about? And I can give you an example of Indonesia where, I have really good friends there. They told me that cardiovascular is a big deal because relatively recently, there were several very high profile business people or politicians who literally died in public of having a heart attack. So we know that, for example, cardiovascular issues is a big issue in Indonesia, but because of that human factor, when it comes to the wow factor of something happening in that particular country, they may decide to focus in a particular area, even though the data may not be there. So that's why when it comes to deploying this technology and thinking of a business case of it, so much of it is also the human element,
Yeah,
which is what people care about. Yeah.
I fully agree. Also, a lot about marketing and how we actually eventually sell the product.
Yeah.
Ichong, you had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, going back to what you touched on just now and some of the questions that are posted here. So when it comes to regulatory approval, what's the best way to position oculomics? Should it be positioned more as a pre-screening tool, given all that you've talked about and the potential barriers? And let's not forget, we also need to be pragmatic when it comes to filing for FDA or any equivalent application as well, because cost is involved. So it'll be a lot easier if it goes with a pre-screening filing. Is that the position that you have in mind?
That's my general sense. Just looking at how difficult and how long the path has been for AI-enabled medical devices to be approved in the US. If we think time is important, I do think that going down the pre-screening route, it's more plausible. And especially, we see a lot of innovation, a lot of product development, and a lot of models development on the innovation side. If you look at the real world implementation of AI technology overall, especially in ophthalmology related stuff, it's still very, very slow. And I would argue that if you look on one hand on the publications and models and whatnot, and the deployment, the gap is getting larger and larger, meaning there's more and more lag in the actual implementation of these tools. And also means we're not really seeing the real world deployment, right? It doesn't matter how many talks you give, how many like nature papers you publish, if it eventually it's not really deployed in the real world, one could argue that it's not really touching a patient. So I personally think there's a larger and larger gap between innovation and real world implementation. So with that in mind, if our goal is to have maximal impacts within a defined certain period of time in our lifetime, hopefully, then I think speed is very important. And if speed is important, then we just have to go down the pre-screening route and try to not have to go through formal regulatory approval all the time, meaning not as billable service. But again, try and demonstrate to stakeholders that this brings value, however you define downstream, and get buy-in to start deploying it.
I totally agree, Alvin. In fact, I feel a lot of times there was a misperception, or rather a misplaced concept that getting regulatory approval is the endpoint, where it is not actually. And a lot of times, even after approval, there needs to be post-market evaluation surveillance, and that is severely lacking in the space of AI health, not just in ophthalmology AI, but in general AI health. So on that note, I do agree that perhaps for oculomics, it is easier to get the first hurdle over, which is filing it as a pre-screening tool. And more importantly, that allows for subsequent post-approval, post-market evaluation, because those are the evaluations that can really give us insights and deeper information whether it really works in the real world or not. So on that note, I do agree.
I mean, your point is well taken because you think about the regulatory framework we have right now is you get approval by regulatory agency if your product works really well, right? So it's really defining the value of the product at that static one time, how well it performs whatever function. It completely does not account for the downstream first, second, and third order effects of the value it generates, and that's a shame. And that's especially relevant when it comes to like a tool like AI-based oculomics. And this is in sharp contrast with the medication because yes, like for medication, if you want to get through regulatory approval, how it works at that moment for that person is very important. Like it's less relevant of the second and third degree, benefits that it creates. Oh, the person gets better. It requires less care from the parents, something like that. So the downstream effects and the value is a much more relevant in this particular context, which unfortunately is not really properly captured if we just go by the traditional regulatory framework.
In the interest of time, maybe we'll just quickly go through a few more questions. There's one that is asking how oculomic filing for regulatory approval as a pre-screening versus maybe AI-based eye disease screening tool. How is it different?
This is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. The best people to ask will be the companies that have had these conversations with regulatory agencies because different countries will have different requirement, and this is definitely a very new science. So what if you and I don't my understanding is that for a lot of the locations around the world, if you are positioning this as a diagnostic device, then you have to meet certain sensitivity and specificity endpoint. I don't, in theoretically speaking, if you're not positioning this as like an actual diagnostic device, all you have to show is that it does not harm people, and the regulatory hurdle is much lower. So, for example, most AI-based medical devices in the US are approved as class 2, so medium risk by FDA. I suspect if you position itself as more like a wellness product, and there's some ones out there, you can get it approved as a class 1, which is very low risk. But when you deploy it, you deploy it as a wellness products without with very specific labeling claims. But just because something is cleared as a wellness product does not mean it cannot be used as a very legitimate pre-screening tool that has medical benefits. It depends on how you label it and how you use it.
Thank you. That's a good point. The next question is a tough one, and I probably need David with his bio design hat. The question on good enough versus gold standard. David.
You want me to answer that? So the question is good enough product versus gold standard based product. How to convince the stakeholders on confidence and comfortable at screening or diagnosing AI as a post-enabled oculomics device. I presume that it circles back to what Alvin mentioned earlier about how we essentially paint the narrative of the product, how we sell this product to the buyer eventually, in terms of the value add, or in terms of providing the pain point, solving the pain point for them. And to be very frank, if it provides some form of healthcare or economic benefit that is cheaper, then it's probably a good or easy enough sell. And I feel that because it really depends on how you position a product as well. If you want to go through gold standard, you want to go through all the FDA clearances you can, it's expensive, but you build up a lot of moat because you have essentially barriers to access. Other companies may not have done the same thing. You can say mine is the only FDA cleared product. Then you have barriers to entry. You can price your product much more expensively. Versus if you want a wellness product that you can get onto the market fast, then once again, you're fighting on speed because you can get it out easily, but other products which can also claim to be wellness, which also can get early or very easy regulatory approval of a class 1 device, they can come in and jump onto the market, and then it becomes a free-for-all in that sense. So I would anticipate that because AI is really changing so fast, if you go by the conventional FDA route, by the time it reaches regulatory approval, things will have moved so fast, which makes sense for this, therefore, to be good enough so that it capture market, and nothing is stopping you from actually making a proper or FDA-approved product in the background while you are actually gaining market share with your good enough product. So that's how I see one strategy being played out.
And building on what David said, I think I can give a specific example. So in an ideal world, a gold standard product, if you're trying to do a binary prediction of whatever you're interested in, ideally you want your product to be highly sensitive and highly specific. But in a lot of situations, it's hard to do that, right? And then a lot of times for these binary classifications, you can adjust the threshold, which is a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. Let's say you have a good enough product that you can either be highly sensitive or highly specific, but not both. Then what do you do with it? Then it depends on your downstream, your customer, right? If you're trying to sell cardiology products, oculomics product to a cardiology so that we can increase referral to a cardiology clinic, then it depends on what they want. If they have a cardiology clinic practice with a lot of capacity, they want to see more patients. So for them, a product that makes sense upstream is one that's highly sensitive. On the flip side, if you are dealing with a clinic that only has 5% additional capacity, they want to see more patients, but they only want to see the ones with something that positive findings. Then on the flip side, they will want an upstream product that's specific. That's what I mean by a good enough product where it's not perfect, but depending on your downstream customer, you can toggle the threshold to fit that needs. And you're able to do that, they'll pay for that essentially.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Alvin and David. Maybe we'll just take one last question, a very quick one, which is on small enough device, a wearable. How do we see this applied in small devices? And of course, maybe I'll just jump on this first. We have seen a lot more smaller portable retina cameras that can capture good enough quality of retina photos. And of course, with those photos, can be sent to cloud, and then we can do the AI analysis. That's one way. But perhaps what the audience is asking is also on how oculomics can be combined with wearable data as well. For example, heart rate, the steps, the sleep pattern from our watches, wearables. So any thoughts on this?
I can go first. So essentially, there's two questions here. One is smaller, better devices, portable devices. The other one is essentially multimodal data.
Mm.
In general, yes, like we all want portable devices. I think when it comes to acquiring retinal images, there's a physical limitation in terms of how good these portable devices are. For two reasons. One, for portable devices, typically you need an operator that with a handheld, it creates a lot of variability when it comes to real world deployment. I think that's just like a human limitation that we'll never be able to get over with. And second, when it comes to the size of the cameras, it only gets that much smaller. Um, not to digress too much, essentially, really to shrink the size of cameras, we need next generation optics, specifically meta surfaces where you have you need nanotechnology basically, and we're not quite there yet. When it comes to portable devices, I can see that being much more important in low and middle income country where access to care is much more a problem. I do think that fortunately for places like Singapore and the US where people have much better access to care, the quality does matter more. So I do not see portable devices scale that much in urban situations and in developed countries. When it comes to combining retinal images with other wearable technology, um, I think this is where the science part is going. We see the vast majority of the commercially available oculomics applications now are based on color fundus photographs for because it's easy to obtain and all those good reasons. There's a lot of research in oculomics using multimodal ophthalmic images, for example, color fundus photograph plus OCT, and you can extend it to other forms of data as well. I would say scientifically interesting, commercially really hard to do, just because it's hard enough to get people image with one mode of ophthalmic imaging, which is color fundus photograph. It's been around for decades. If you start combining all these things, it just makes it so hard to implement in real world. I think commercial traction will be difficult.
Just to add on and maybe add an optimistic touch, I suppose the answer is yes if you give it long enough into the future. With oculomics, we need some of ophthalmic data. So capturing the ophthalmic data at its current moment using wearables may be still tricky. And but if you're talking about wearables in terms of detecting health diseases, then certainly that's something that's possible in the near future. Yeah, and I think that's how I would see it. And I agree that multimodal data adds another layer of complexity. Already, we are seeing potential issues with interoperability of different devices, different images, because AI does not think the way and does not see the way that we do with our human eyes. So if we add in additional wearables on top of the fundus imaging that require tabletop devices, it may be actually counterintuitive for the consumer or the end user. Yeah.
The one silver lining is that I think if we think about pre-screening really in the community level, a very big funnel, ultimately we'll have to stick with single modal just because ease of like deployment. However, in medicine overall, there's another huge trend which is decentralization of medicine, like meaning we really want to push care away from hospital, away from traditional healthcare setting, because it's just getting too expensive. There will be a lot more at-home care for many different conditions across the board. And you want to do at-home care, you need remote monitoring, remote with wearables. So I think that's where it would start like shining, but not so much in the pre-screening, like patient acquisition funnel, stage.
Oh, thank you, Alvin, David. Unique insights, and what a wonderful way to end this session. So we have come to the end of the session, and with all the great discussion, we have exceeded the time a little bit, but that's all good. Like to once again thank Dr. Alvin Liu for being our wonderful speaker, giving us such a insightful talk today. And of course, to my colleague, Dr. David Chen, for the interactive discussion. So once again, thank you to both, and thank you to all participants for staying through. Please stay tuned. We have 3 more InVision webinars coming up the next 3 months until the end of the year. And these are all exciting. So please stay tuned, watch out for your inboxes. There will be announcements coming up soon. Thanks very much again, Alvin, and I hope to see you soon. Thank
Yep.
you, David.
Bye.
And to the
Thank
rest
you.
of
Take
you,
care.
good night. Thank you.